Morning, everybody. Welcome to this fantastic event on this beautiful sunny morning. I hope it's as sunny with you as it is with us here in Liverpool. I'm Chris Harrop. I'm the Managing Director of MIAA, one of the 5 partners of the collaborative, and welcome to this amazing event. It's always one of our flagship events, as we say, and it comes at the start of the year, which is really important in terms of setting the scene for how things are at the moment and just thinking about the year to come. The event is run by, as I say, the collaborative. I'll just say a little bit about the collaborative before I move on and do a bit of a housekeeping. So the collaborative, as you can see from the slide that's in front of you, is a collaborative of 5 partners across the Northwest. So there's ourselves, MIAA, there's the AQUA, Advancing Quality Alliance, NHS Northwest Leadership Academy, Northwest Employers, and of course, Northwest Association of Directors of Adult Social Care, ADAS. So in terms of today, just a little bit of housekeeping before I move through and introduce Richard. So in terms of practical things, if you could please keep your microphones muted throughout the sessions. There will be plenty of opportunity for interaction. So as you can see already, we've got a chat box running at the side. So if you've got any comments that you want to pop into the chat box whilst our presenters are presenting, please do so. There's also, as you can see from the agenda, lots of opportunity for questions and answers at the end of each of those sessions. So there's lots of potential opportunities for you to get involved and participate and give us your views. So please do that. But of course, while the presenters are speaking, if you can keep everything muted, that would be great. Thank you. We are also recording the session. So again, you can probably see already that the recording button is on. So just be aware that we are recording. The session will be available online for everyone to pick up afterwards once the event's closed. So that'll be posted on our websites in the usual way. So all that's left for me to do really is to introduce Richard Stubbs, who I'm really pleased to say is joining us once again to chair this fantastic event. Richard, as you can see from the slide, is Chief Executive of Yorkshire and Humber AHSN. Richard is a very experienced and passionate leader in health innovation, and we'll be really looking forward to hearing his insights as well as we go through the morning session. So at that point, I don't think there's anything else that I need to say. Welcome, Richard. Great to have you again, and over to you to take us through the presenters. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for that, and morning, everyone. So yes, I'm Richard Stubbs, as Chris said, Chief Executive of Yorkshire and Humber AHSN. It's an absolute pleasure to be supporting this event again, and I was delighted to be asked back, not least of which because I personally found it such a hugely insightful session last time around. I mean, not to put any pressure on our speakers, but it was such a great session last year, which really stuck with me and resonated with me for the whole 12-month cycle. And I'm really looking forward, I think. I mean, every time we come to these things, you always find yourself thinking that, things have changed so dramatically, and yet 12 months on, things change again. So I'm really looking forward, I think, given the current landscape and given perhaps where we're heading to in the future, and of course now we're entering into an election cycle, to hearing from our speakers today about the current outlook for the public sector and perhaps some insight into what the next 12 months is going to bring for us. It's great to see everyone introducing themselves in the chat. So lovely to see people. As Chris said, plenty of time for interaction later. So as we go through the day, do keep your questions coming, and the team will be looking to pick out those questions as we go. As you can see on the agenda there, we're going to start off with Saffron Cordery, who I'll introduce in just one second. There'll be then time to have a quick Q&A with Saffron before she has to leave us. John Jackson from the National Care and Health Improvement Advisor from Finance Partners in Health and Care, and then Anita Charlesworth from the Health Foundation. We'll have a wider Q&A at the end, but we will take time with each speaker after their presentation to just pick up on the specific areas of focus that they've covered as well, before concluding with a panel and some key messages from all of us. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Saffron Cordery. Now, Saffron has been NHS Providers Deputy Chief Executive since 2018, and also just recently between June last year and February just gone, she was the interim Chief Executive. She's worked in healthcare sector since 2007. I'm sure all of you know that NHS Providers, Saffron's organisation, is the membership organisation for NHS hospital, mental health, community and ambulance services. Saffron undoubtedly has extensive experience in policy development, influence and communications, and before moving into healthcare, Saffron was head of public affairs at the Local Government Association, the LGA, the voice of local councils in England. Saffron, thank you very much for joining us. It's lovely to see you again, and I will hand over to you for your presentation.
That's fab. Thank you so much, Richard, for a lovely introduction. And I am absolutely delighted to be here. And it's my first time doing this event. My old boss, Chris Hopson, used to do this previously, but I've been really looking forward to both the presentation and the conversation that will come afterwards. And my apologies that I can't stay for the whole morning. The only way I could fit it in was just to do this slot. And I think just to build on Richard's introduction there, I think it's also worth saying that as well as having all of the trusts across England from every sector in membership, we also do offer associate membership to ICBs as well, on the basis that it's really important that we are also fully engaging with those organisations that our members come into contact with day in, day out. And so we offer that associate membership to ICBs, and we also have a very close relationship with primary care and local government, and think really carefully about the role of trusts in systems given the world in which we are now operating. Can I have my next slide, please? So what I'm going to do today is kind of do a bit of a look back and then a bit of a look forward in order to meet the question, which is, you know, the outlook for the public sector, but what does that actually mean for healthcare and for providers on the front line? And I think the first thing to say is that it's been another incredibly challenging year on the NHS front line. I think that if you wind back 12 months, I think what we were looking at then was, you know, a sense of how do we come off the back of, you know, raging COVID rates and all of the challenges that unleashed for the NHS. And we were very much in a space of COVID starting to settle down a little. I think I would always say that COVID isn't behind us. It's not gone till it's gone, really. And we know that it does cause challenges. But there was that sense that we were starting to get a handle on how we treat and manage COVID. Vaccinations were truly taking a hold and levels were steadying out. So this time last year, that's where we were at. And I don't think until the summer we quite anticipated how challenging this year would be. We all know that recovery is difficult. So recovery from COVID was always going to be hard. But then I think there's very much been this sense that actually it's recovery with a whole load of obstacles thrown in, which are important not only for this year, but they're also important for how the NHS provider sector and the NHS as a whole is going to navigate the coming years. So I think the things that characterise this past year have been the political upheaval, inflation and industrial action, and resilience and innovation. And I'll just go into these in just a little more detail. So in terms of that political upheaval, we've seen it from a number of elements. You know, we've got this kind of we've had this revolving door of key politicians, key ministerial roles, in fact, the top jobs in the country changing with a regularity that we haven't seen for decades. So that has been incredibly challenging. You know, we've had the revolving door of prime ministers in the last year, the last 12 months. We've seen Johnson, we've seen Truss, and now we've got Sunak. That's a massive change in and of itself. Alongside that, we have had 4 different secretaries of state. So we started last year with Sajid Javid. We then had Steve Barclay doing what I call his summer job, his internship at the Department of Health. Then we had Therese Coffey for a short period of time, and then we went back again to Steve Barclay. So that's a big set of changes. And then in terms of the purse strings, who holds the purse strings? The Chancellor. That has changed 3 times as well. So we had Zahawi, then we had Kwasi Kwarteng, and now we've got Jeremy Hunt since last October or so. So, you know, we are in this situation where political upheaval has both undermined the ability of anyone to take any meaningful decisions that will last, and has also undercut continuity. And we all know for the NHS, the one thing we aspire to is steady state. And I don't think that we have seen that. And I think there have been a number of consequences from that. And in particular, I would probably cite the passage of the Health and Social Care Bill probably was a bit of a casualty of that, in terms of starting life under one regime and then finishing its passage through Parliament under another regime with additions and changes that perhaps undercut the coherence of that legislation, which was a critical piece of legislation for the NHS frontline. It established statutory roles for integrated care systems, and it also gave wider direct powers to the Secretary of State for Health to intervene both in the front line, but also intervene with central bodies, including NHS England. And the final bit of political upheaval is the forward-looking bit. We really are now on the countdown to the general election, and whilst the campaign isn't formally launched, I think everything is looked at through that prism of campaigning for a general election. What does it mean? Who's positioning themselves, and how are they kind of circling the wagons in terms of where they're going to be? And I think we are seeing the opposition, Labour in particular, upping the ante around a number of issues, including health. So that's the political upheaval, which I think we need to look at as having had quite a chilling effect and a big impact across NHS decision making. The next bit is equally impactful in terms of where it's left the NHS frontline. So we all know about, you know, the rising inflation and some of that playing into the start of industrial action. It's not the whole cause of the industrial action, of course, but I think it was a kind of final catalyst to cement that decision to take industrial action. And I look at the inflation issue through kind of two prisms, really. One has been the overall impact on the cost of living. We know how much the prices have risen, consumer prices. We know how much that has impacted those on not just on low salaries, but also on kind of middle income salaries. And that incorporates a lot of NHS frontline staff, as well as other staff working across social care and in local government. I think it's fair to say that this has caused some real issues, both in terms of how staff are or aren't able to carry out their day-to-day roles. Are they themselves work ready? Are they skipping meals? We did a survey last year that showed that many staff were starting to say that they were skipping meals in order to feed their family, or that they were skipping meals in order to travel to work. We also have a situation where it impacts on the availability of new recruits to the NHS, particularly in those lower pay grades, because the lure of other employers that might offer greater benefits than the NHS, like free travel or subsidised travel or higher hourly rates of pay. You know, we're talking about the retail sector here and hospitality, have lured some people away from the NHS or have deterred others from joining the NHS. And this is particularly the case in the run up to Christmas, where, you know, we need the NHS workforce more than ever as we enter that winter period. So I think we have had this great sense of of inflation and the cost of living really impacting staff themselves. Of course, it's also impacted frontline budgets. Things are simply costing more, which means that trusts' finances don't go as far as they have done previously. Some of that increase was and has been picked up by NHS England in their allocations, but the cumulative impact of that has meant that budgets have been more stretched than they were previously. And we know that that's particularly the case when we look at things like building maintenance and any kind of capital investment across the NHS and across trusts. And I suppose the final thing to say on the cost of living elements is that, of course, we're expecting inflation levels to come down towards the end of this year. That's incredibly welcome. But what we do know is that the overall level of prices has risen. So people will continue to struggle unless their pay and other elements rise up to meet that. So we know that there's going to be an ongoing challenge there. Of course, alongside the inflation, we have seen the industrial action. It became patently obvious back last summer that we were going to see industrial action be balloted for across many sectors of the NHS frontline. We saw it in Agenda for Change staff first, and all of the strikes that rolled out there from before Christmas and throughout the new year. And now, obviously, we have seen it with these very far-reaching periods of strike action from the BMA, 3-day strike and then a 4-day strike last week after a 4-day bank holiday, which was had a particularly widespread impact. But what we know that means is that whilst trusts will obviously apply themselves to managing what's going on in terms of treating industrial action with the appropriate seriousness, preparing for that, really focusing all their efforts on how they're going to keep patients safe, meet emergency demands, etc. What we do know is that isn't sustainable in the longer term. And it does mean that while the NHS is lurching from one round of strike action to the next, it's harder for it to focus on elements such as, service transformation, elective backlog recovery, any kind of service recovery, indeed, across all of the services. So industrial action is probably the key element of disruption to NHS services this year. But I think it's fair to say that despite all of those challenges, starting this financial year 22-23, the previous financial year, with coming off the back of COVID and all of the challenges that presented, and then being faced by cost of living rises and industrial action, we have seen the NHS really show its resilience and innovation and demonstrate how it can get through despite all the challenges. And I was really struck, particularly with the cost of living issues, how trusts really stepped up to support their staff, opening food banks, opening school uniform banks, giving subsidised travel to staff, offering loans, everything that they could do to help manage what was an incredibly and remains an incredibly difficult situation. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So I think if we have that as the core backdrop to where we are now, and think about the prospect for the NHS as part of one of the key players in the public sector, I think it's fair to say that there are 5 fault lines that really do endure and cast a long shadow across NHS services and what needs to be overcome. I think the important thing to remember here is that COVID exacerbated a pre-existing set of conditions that were undermining the NHS's ability to deliver on its core targets, deliver on service transformation. So I would summarise those fault lines as being a financial fault line. We know all of the narrative around the funding squeeze in light of austerity and policy decisions that were taken. But we have, over the last decade and a bit, seen the longest and deepest funding squeeze in the NHS's history. And even when we had the big injection of spending during for the NHS's 70th birthday, which was incredibly welcome. And I know I'm on this platform with representatives from other bits of the public sector who I know don't get as generous a settlement. So I do understand the pressures across the public sector. But basically what we saw there was simply that additional funding going into really sort of filling the hole, the gap that had emerged. And that is always a challenge when you get that extra funding, but it's still not taking you back to a baseline where you need to continue. And linked to that, we've seen capacity increasingly mismatched to demand. And I think that is the combination of both growing demand due to a number of factors. Obviously, demographic is one of them, lifestyle is another, but also I would contend that it is the impact of a focus that has moved away from public health and prevention in the way that we genuinely need to see it in order to kind of get ahead of the curve and help people to avoid becoming unwell, avoid hospital and other service admissions. And I would say that the undermining of investment across local government and the investment that local government makes in civil society, voluntary sector, community sector, which support many groups that support patients, service users, we see that building of a set of factors that mean that actually prevention is being undermined rather than boosted. Linked to capacity, of course, is workforce and the shortage of workforce. We're still at over 120,000 vacancies across the NHS. We know that we need to see a long-term workforce plan that is fully funded and fully costed. We haven't had that kind of data and intelligence formally taken on board for a very significant period of time. And I think it's very important to note how those workforce gaps have grown. They steadied slightly during COVID due to the desperate need and focus around COVID, but they are widening again broadly. And we know that there are many factors that impact that, but one of them is, of course, I would say Brexit has played into this, but also the changing nature of work and people's changing demands of work, and our inability to offer people a manageable, doable job day to day, and the levels of pressure and stress that play into that. So capacity and workforce really do go hand in hand in terms of being one of those kind of key fault lines that undermine the NHS's ability to deliver. Alongside that, and I know we'll be hearing from John shortly, so I won't go into this, social care. We are desperately needing a long-term solution to social care. We know that it's, the interdependence between the NHS and social care has been talked about many and oft, but it is a critical element of what we need to see. Social care is, of course, important in its own right to give people the care they need and enable them to live the kind of lives that they want to live. But a fully functioning social care system is also absolutely critical to things like patient flow and avoiding hospital admissions and helping discharge people from hospital and other settings. And then the final fault line, which really, I think, came to the fore during COVID, was this notion that we have a health system that's focused on treatment rather than wellness. And critically, until now hasn't properly taken health inequalities on board. And we know the work that is being carried out now by NHS England and others on Core 20+5 really is demonstrating how tackling health inequalities is helping to bring down the backlog of elective and other care. It's not the only reason to tackle health inequalities. It's absolutely critical that we understand all of the factors that impact on individuals' health, well-being, and their illnesses too. And we need to get ahead of that. But also it's absolutely critical to understand unless we do, we aren't going to tackle some of those really wicked issues that we're facing. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So I'm not going to talk through this slide in detail. We all have our versions, don't we, of kind of performance charts and what it actually means. But what we do know is over the last few years, NHS performance, if we take that to be performance against A&E, cancer and elective standards, is under huge pressure. We've got activity increases, but performance is declining, and that is despite huge efforts by staff. So we can see these lines, the red line, the purple line, and the turquoise line there, demonstrating the percentage falls of meeting those targets across the piece. Slight steadying out in the 4-hour target on A&E attendances, but I think we know that is a pretty challenging area, and it's been very much the spotlight of political and media attention, and also the spotlight of and also a particular issue for ambulance services and handover delays there. We then got the focus on the 62-day waiting time target, where it's a slightly less sharp decline, but it's still a decline. And then elective treatment, we know the story there, over 7.2 million people on the waiting list now. And that is, I think, the big focus going forward. Can I have the next slide, please? However, we shouldn't only be thinking about acute care, because we know that there has been sustained demand and pressure on mental health services. And we have seen in particular the focus on children and young people's eating disorders, and children and young people's referral in general have been going through the roof. This is something that has been really significantly exacerbated by COVID, by the lockdown. And I think that it's absolutely critical that we have going forward a sustained focus on what is happening to children and young people. Can I have my next slide, please? So that segues nicely into this notion that children and young people are at the moment, and have been over the last few years, the forgotten group. And this is particularly important because not only does it impact individuals and their families, so really long waits are having a massive impact on young people's development, their output, their outcomes, and their experiences. But also it is storing up problems for the future, which is storing up demand for the future. We know that if you tackle in particular mental health issues in young people as early as you can, you stop that progressing into a crisis situation or into an ongoing mental health condition that needs significant treatment. So we know getting in early and early intervention is an absolutely critical element of this. And if we look at this slide, you can see that it's not just about mental health. We are seeing the challenges across all parts of the local public sector. I've mentioned social care in here. We know that there are challenges in delivering for vulnerable children and young people. We've got to see the right capacity in there. We know, and it's a theme that goes across all of these areas, is recruitment and retention is a key issue in social care, as it is in mental health and community. I think in terms of community services, I think community services are typically slightly invisible to both the wider healthcare sector and also the wider public, but they play a key role in supporting young people, particularly those with specific issues such as those needing speech and language therapy. And of course, again, there's this link between staff shortages and those areas with backlog. I've talked a little about mental health, but also in acute hospital care, we do have an increasing number of children waiting for surgery. There is no national target for children and young people, and many across the stakeholder community have been asking for the government to launch a strategy on children's health conditions, because it is such a pressing area. It's a pressing area for those children now, and it's going to be a pressing area in the future. Can I have my next slide, please? So I think that picture, in terms of thinking about the kind of the upheavals that we've seen over the past year, the performance pressures that we are seeing now, and that particular issue around children and young people storing up problems for the future, does demonstrate that there are some really big challenges facing the provider sector and its future prospects. So I've listed some of these here. You know, we've got that big issue around care backlogs for elective mental health and community services, and they all interlock, they all intersect. We know that if we don't treat people in the community in mental health in a timely fashion, then individuals will become crises, and crises often turn up at A&E departments, often taking a long time to have their needs met, often contributing to the very significant delays across accident and emergency departments. So, you know, thinking about how we manage those backlogs in care for mental health services, and ditto for community services, thinking about what they need, particularly their roles in treating people in their own homes and preventing hospital admissions into acute services, absolutely critical. I've mentioned the workforce shortages and unresolved pay disputes. I think what comes with that is also low staff morale, and that is a critical factor. It's incredibly hard, given the last few years that we've had, to really corral staff again to meet new challenges, to focus on recovery, to focus on transformation. And I think that it links to low staff morale, absolutely links to these challenges around, are we delivering the right quality of care, and are we protecting staff from the moral injury that they will suffer from working in these very difficult circumstances. What I haven't mentioned particularly today is access to capital. That's not because it's not a big and important issue. It's in fact one of the key issues, and it's kind of one of those underpinning elements that does mean that it's impossible actually to be able to run good and effective high quality services that give patients the right experience with an NHS estate that has a backlog of over £10 billion worth of work that needs to be carried out, and a real uncertainty about where we're going next with things like hospital rebuilds and the new hospital programme. And that does, I've put this big kind of call out star there on productivity. The lack of access to capital does really play into productivity, and it plays into how staff are able to do their jobs well and effectively, and it plays into how we might meet those backlogs of care. If one of your operating theatres is out of action because the air conditioning doesn't work, that puts you significantly, it is kind of leg in a trap territory in terms of being able to get through your lists day in, day out, and really get the work done. Alongside that, we're going to see those big political expectations ahead of the next general election, and we are going to see more focus on what the public thinks in terms of the NHS. We know it's declining. I know Anita's going to talk about that in some detail, but it does lead to this narrative of a failing service. Can I have the next slide, please? This has been slightly doom and gloom. I apologise for that, but it is where we're at. However, I think the piece that does come through for me is the fact that there are some really significant opportunities. So we know that trusts are really taking advantage of their role working in systems, collaboration, collective ownership of the challenges. And we have seen this much more permissive approach to provider collaboratives. That's groups of providers getting together to deliver services more effectively, more efficiently, meeting patient needs better and meeting their population's needs. And I think that this is a really important bit of progress, which is foundations are now set for this genuine focus on population health, looking at health inequalities and the wider determinants of health. The public debate around the sustainability of the NHS is a challenge and it is a threat to some extent, but it also demonstrates, provides the opportunity to demonstrate that investing in the NHS is a sound investment because it brings huge social and economic benefits. And you know, the notion of NHS trusts and other local public sector organisations being anchor institutions might be a bit of jargon, but it does speak to the role that they play, often being the biggest local employer, the biggest local trainer, the biggest local purchaser of goods, particularly catering, for example. So we do know the importance of demonstrating that investment, why the NHS is a sound investment. And depending on how the industrial action plays out, there have been some really good and positive gains in elective recovery, which I think are starting to bring down those backlogs at pace in particular groups of the waiting list. But we do have a long way to go. Can I have my final slide, please? So the key questions for me really in terms of informing our thinking going ahead is, you know, how do we get ahead of the fact that the general election is looming for next year? How far and fast can we go before the kind of guillotine drops on that one and we really are genuinely into campaigning mode, no decisions are taken? You know, I think there's a real imperative to go as quickly as we can right now. I think we know that morale is suffering. How can we do all we can to support our workforces at all levels? I sometimes think that trust leaders and local public service leaders are also an overlooked group in this. They've been carrying the load for a significant period and there must be a great deal of fatigue out there at every level. But we need a super motivated, high morale workforce to get through what needs to be done. And critically, how do we all make the noise and case for the NHS given the current and growing media chatter about whether it has a future and the political chatter about whether it has a future? I'm going to leave it there. I'm really happy to take any questions in the remaining 10 minutes.
Saffron, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. A great summary. And as colleagues on the call know, we've only got Saffron now for 10 minutes, so please do get your questions in through chat and we will pick them up as you do. I'm going to take chair's prerogative, Saffron, and just and ask you the first question. You talked a few times now about the countdown to the election.
Yeah.
We obviously know, as always, the NHS will be part of the election battleground, but I'm just interested in your views about this time around, where the focus of the political debate may be. And the reason I mention that is because I think, to generalize completely, in previous election cycles, you've been able to characterize either the NHS is working or the NHS isn't working type of arguments, depending on who's in power. I think I sense from most main parties now a sense of reform is needed. And therefore, is there a sense that this time around it's going to be about the nature of reform rather than a sense of the NHS is or isn't working? You mentioned it just in your last slide there, that more and more now there's this fundamental question being asked in various parts of the media about the very model of the NHS. And I just wonder if the battleground therefore is going to be about reform to fix the status quo, or reform to fundamentally change our model of what healthcare provision looks like in this country, and if you've got a sense of that.
Yeah, I mean, it is the question, I was going to say the question of the moment, but it's the question of many moments now going forward. I think that will be the general election question, won't it? Is the NHS fit for purpose, and does it need reform? I think we will see a coalescence of views around probably Labour really focusing on, we are the party of the NHS, we are going to fix it, it's broken, but we stand behind its principles, I think. And I think we will see very many voices, different voices from the government and others saying this can't go on in this way. I think the challenges and dangers of that are that, certainly from my perspective, I would say, would you, given the level of elective backlog, given the level of demand from services, given the need to reform social care, the NHS is in a hugely challenging position, and I don't think that's the position from which you would wish to reform something. And I think the amount of time, focus and distraction that reforming the NHS right now would take, if say the solution, if people are posing the solution as a kind of social insurance model, for example, that surely is a 5 to 10 year project. Can we afford for our health service to be distracted in that way? No. Can we afford to support it and help it evolve? Yes. Can we afford to support it and help it focus on transformation? Yes. And to help it deliver not just on its core task, but its wider benefits as well. So I think you're right, but it's going to be really challenging. And I think it's for everyone who works in the NHS to both, yes, highlight the challenges, but also highlight the solutions and highlight the benefits of what the NHS currently delivers. Because I think sometimes we forget that in the kind of, the narrative, a bit like the one that I've just set out, where it's a lot of problems.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And actually, NHS 75, and you mentioned about NHS 70, but NHS 75 is an opportunity for us to rally our arguments around that, isn't
Totally.
it? Yeah. Let's move to the here and now then. So Helen Boyles asked a great question about workforce. So you mentioned obviously the challenges around workforce. Helen asks, what's the one thing that will make a difference on the workforce challenge in your view, Saffron?
I think it's plain and simple, actually, which is I think it does require a pay rise. End of, actually, because we know that, we talk around, I think we talk a lot, certainly at NHS providers and certainly with the trust that we represent, that obviously there's more to work than pay. But basically the reason people come to work, yes, everyone wants a career and a vocation, but at the end of the day, it's about taking home a decent wage that fully recognises the role and the contribution that you make. And so I think that pay is core and pay is key. And then there are other elements that sit around that. I think that sometimes trusts will obviously focus on many of the elements that sit around that, because negotiating pay isn't within their gift. It's the thing that sits outside of their gift. So therefore, trusts must focus on, what is this like as a place to work? And of course that matters. Is my line manager fit for purpose, we know that that's a key influencing factor, but actually fundamentally pay terms and conditions are the things that really matter.
Yeah.
And I include in that things like flexibility, which we know is a growing pressure.
Yes, absolutely. David Brown's asked a question about social care. So David, I'm going to ask this for Saffron, but also we've got John Jackson coming up next. So I think we'll probably put a pin in this question and ask John the same question. The social care question is about discharge, Saffron. So obviously we know that discharge can be a blocker in terms of hospital flow, which then exacerbates a lot of the issues you've mentioned in your challenges. So same question, I guess, what's the thing that we need to do most? And I suppose coming from a provider's side, it might be interesting from your angle about, from an NHS perspective, what do we need to do to increase flow and discharge?
So I think there is a really I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying some of these things, but I think when we, I did have social care as one of my, it's one of the 5 fault lines that we have seen as the thing that is undermining the NHS's ability to meet those care backlogs. And I think that essentially what we need to see is a model of social care that is more fit for purpose. So the government has promised reform of social care, and then when it gets to it, it just kicks the can down the road, or it brings out half measures that don't quite do it. So I don't think there is a one fiddling around the edge solution on social care. It feels to me that, it's the biggest thing that needs to happen. I did some media work over the weekend, and I was asked what question what issue I would put to Wes Streeting as his biggest issue for the NHS, and I asked for reform of social care. So for me, it's about how do we get a system of social care that is fit for purpose, and I think there are wider bits rolled into that as well about proper funding for local government. I mean, we've got a really, local government over the last 10 years has seen, what is it, a 50 or 60% decrease in its budget. That's massive and ridiculous. So, that's what we need to see.
Yeah. Thank you. Grenville's asked a question about population health. So you talked about, obviously, the foundations have been laid. So some really good foundations laid across systems in terms of our approach and focus on population health. I think Grenville's point, just to paraphrase, is that great as a desire, but progress can be very slow. And obviously we've got, with the workforce crisis and the elective backlog, etc., it's no surprise that maybe we're taking our eye off the ball of our population health responsibilities. What Grenville asks is, how can we really leverage the full potential of our civil society organisations? So he goes on to talk about housing, education, multi-academy trusts, voluntary community sectors, etc., in order to have a genuine population health approach in systems.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think it comes from two parallel elements, actually. So this is where integrated care systems should and must come into their own. So we know that ICSs are broken into 2 elements. There's the integrated care boards, and then there's the integrated care partnership. And the integrated care partnership does indeed bring all of those organisations together around the table to set the strategy for a system area and how does it tackle population health. That's one of the 4 key things that ICSs as an entirety are there to do. So I think that having that approach on a statutory footing, and in many places we are really seeing that forge ahead in terms of understanding the needs of populations, using data much more effectively, and really thinking about how do we meet the needs of those who are the most vulnerable in our communities and need most support. So it's that equity issue. So that's one pillar. The other pillar, I think, is actually some of the work that is being done to tackle elective backlog recovery. So yes, in some ways the eyes are taken off the health, kind of the population health ball, and put onto the target of cutting those waiting times. But what we do know is that the core 20+5 approach on health inequalities in some places is both getting through those waiting lists and also helping people understand, not quite for the first time, but understanding more what the particular needs are of groups within their communities who have the most pressing, you know, they are in the top categories for needing their procedure to be carried out. So, you know, it comes from both elements of where we're at, both in terms of what trusts can do, but also what systems can do. And I think there is huge potential there.
Saffron, thank you so much for that. And thank you for kicking us off so brilliantly and for finding the time in your day. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure, and I'm so sorry I can't be there for the whole morning, but I hope the rest of the day is really, really good.
Thank you, Saffron, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Fantastic. So now we're going to go to our second speaker, John Jackson. So since 2017, John's worked for the LGA, the Local Government Association, as a National Care and Health Improvement Advisor, advising local authorities on managing financial pressures and risks within adult social care. John's also involved in national issues which concern adult social care. He meets regularly with the Department of Health and Social Care and providers to discuss financial issues affecting social care. In the last year, he spent time advising on the continuing financial pressures facing adult social care, as well as the financial issues that arise from the proposals for reform, notably the cost of care work and charging reform. John, you've already got a quick tip off from the questions to Saffron that will be coming to you about discharge. So I'm sure you'll be picking that up as well. But John, lovely to see you, and over to you for your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. What I would say is, in relation to the issue that came up for Saffron, the best if I could deal with that at the end. I think what I want to do is set the scene here. If we can move on a couple of slides. The next slide explains what Partners in Care and Health is, so that's primarily for people's information. But move on to the next slide, please. So what I want to do is, first of all, if people have read my biography, they'll have seen I came into adult social care relatively towards the maturing end of my career. I came in about 15 years ago, and prior to that I'd worked in local government within financial roles. And one of the things I learned very quickly when I went into adult social care was my knowledge of adult social care was relatively limited. And I think my experience of working more widely is that the knowledge about adult social care is even within the NHS, is sometimes not as good as it should be. And so I do want to spend a little bit of time going back to basics about what adult social care is. I then want to take you through some national data about activity and spending. I think it's really crucial we come back to that. There's too much I think discussion based on prejudices around that we need to address. I think it's also important, particularly for NHS colleagues, that they understand that adult social care is a crucial part of local government. It's great that Saffron emphasised the funding of local government and the impact then on adult social care. But I think what I want to do is explain a little bit about how financial decisions in particular are made within local government. And then finally, and this is focusing specifically on where we're looking forward, is what are the challenges facing adult social care? And to some extent, Saffron's already covered some of those, which has been great. So if we can move on now, please. And again, please. So the important thing is people often focus on adult social care in terms of people being in care homes. The media very much focus on that. Some people will then focus about people getting care in their own home. Actually, it's much broader than that. We've got a holistic view, which is broadly about trying to make sure that people can live as independently as possible, as ordinary lives as possible. It's particularly important for people with disabilities. And I've quoted here the social care future vision. That's the starting point for it. But when it comes down to it, we need to distinguish social care, which is personal care, as opposed to healthcare. Now, both of these are really important, and it tends to be the people who are most likely to need healthcare, also most likely to need personal care. But by personal care, it is relatively simple tasks that some people are unable to do, such as getting dressed, getting washed, going to the toilet, help with eating, and providing psychological support to people who need it. Whilst most older people are likely to need some sort of personal care at some point in time in their lives before they die, the fact is, at any point in time, there's only about 5% of the population getting long-term care organised by councils. And that's not an argument that the figure should be higher. Most older people are classed as anybody aged 65 or older, and I must declare a slight interest. I am now 65. Most older people do not need care and will be horrified if you suggested they did. But longer term, it is likely that I may need, but there's about 50% chance that I will need personal care before I die. It's also worth emphasising that nearly most personal care is actually provided by unpaid carers, typically the partner or spouse of the person, and sometimes they're providing care for each other, but it could also be sons and daughters, or friends, or other relatives who are providing care. It's also worth saying is there's assumption that somebody is beginning to maybe becoming a bit frail or so forth, and that they automatically will get care. And the fact is they don't, because there are eligibility criteria which are not set by local government, but actually set nationally as part of the Care Act. And I'll come on to this in a later slide, which determine whether people will get care or not. And sometimes when people talk about unmet need, that is people who've would like some help, but their needs are not sufficiently complex to meet those national criteria that are set. And then the final point is, which I think nearly everybody's familiar with, is adult social care is not a free service, and people have to pay depending on their means. And in practice, most people in the care system are paying something towards their care. So I'll move on to the next slide. I've touched on the Care Act. This slide really focuses on the conditions about eligibility, and you can see there essentially people need, it's like essentially people will have a disability or some sort of mental health condition, and they will need help on, if you go back to that list of activities of daily living, they'll need help on at least 2, and in practice often 3, before they would be eligible for care. And it's also worth saying, and this links to the psychological support, is that by doing this, this will have a big an impact on an adult's well-being. If I move on to the next slide, which covers to the issue of charging, we know that's not on the immediate domain. The Minister for Care Services position is that she still would like to see it introduced in October 25, but obviously that's the other side of the general election, so the final decision on that will be taken by the new government. But just to remind you on some basic things is essentially, if a local authority assesses an individual as being eligible for a care package, then they will be also assessed in terms of their resources. And so they'll have to provide financial information about their savings and their income. And if they have savings or other capital assets more than £23,250 a week, they will be expected to pay the full cost of their care and support. And it's probably worth saying, let's take somebody who retired at the age of 65, and they receive as part of their pension a lump sum of say £30,000. If they then have a stroke and they need somebody to come in to help them to get washed and dressed each morning and to go to bed, they will pay the full cost of that care. Equally, if they've got an occupational pension, say of £200 a week on top of their retirement pension, the state retirement pension, they will pay quite a significant amount towards the cost of that care package, and potentially nearly all of it. It's also worth saying anybody in a care home, including those with no resources other than the state pension, do pay quite a lot towards their care, because effectively what local authorities do, and this is the rules set out by central government, is they take most of the state pension and that contributes towards the care, and the individual is left with just under £30 a week in terms of to pay for personal expenses. And of course, there are many people, and this was the debate about charging reform, who pay the full cost, which could be over £1,000 a week in some care homes. If I move on to the next slide, I'm now turning to the next part of the presentation, which is looking at to provide you some data. This is based on the published data from the NHS Digital. It's the data that local authorities provide on both the numbers of people getting care and what sort of care they're getting, but also how much is spent on the cost of providing care and on other elements of adult social care. So let's look at the numbers getting support. In 21-22, there were over 800,000 people who are getting long-term care. So this is a care package which will carry on almost indefinitely until they die, with the exception of some people whose needs significantly reduce over that period of time, possibly because they've got an illness where their condition has improved. So it's 800,000 people. Just put it in context, for younger adults, people aged between 18 and 64, that's just over 8 younger adults out of every 1,000 that are getting long-term care, and nearly all of those is because they were born with a significant disability. The biggest group is people with learning disabilities, significant learning disabilities or autism, but it also will include people who are born with complex needs as a result of a physical disability. There are some people obviously acquire disabilities as an adult, such as say through a significant road traffic accident, which leaves them permanently disabled. In terms of older people, as I mentioned earlier on, that 529,000 people compares to the 10 million people who are aged over 65, which is where the 5% figure comes from. Let's move on now. The next slide looks at spend, and this is slightly complicated in terms of what's actually happening, because this isn't just about local government. There is spending on adult social care, which is funded by other parts of the public sector. The total spending on gross spending on adult social care in 21-22 was nearly £27 billion. 22 billion pounds of that is funded by local government, with including client contributions coming in to pay for it as well. There is quite a significant element, including it in the figures, of funding from the NHS, 4.1 billion. The biggest element of that is from money from the original Better Care Fund, the decisions that were made in about 2016-17, which has been subsequently increased over the time. But there are other NHS contributions that will come in to which pay for social care as opposed to people's healthcare needs. And then there is a small amount of over £500 million, which is funded by other arrangements. If I move on to the next slide, what this does is take the £22 billion and say, what's that spent on? So of the £22 billion local government spend, over £17 billion is spent on short-term care and long-term care packages. And if we move on to the next slide, I give some analysis of that information. The first thing is to say is that the debate publicly about spending on adult social care in nearly all the time focuses on older people. In practice, as the previous slide shows, the amount spent on younger adults is nearly the same amount as spent on older people, despite the fact there's twice as many younger adults, more than twice as many older people receiving long-term care. So the relative spend on younger adults is greater, effectively twice as much as it is on older people. It's also worth saying, I've just realized a typo in the first line. It should say spending on younger adults has increased quicker than older people. It's been a trend over the last few years, and I think it reflects two things. One is local authorities have been, I think, pretty successful at identifying ways in which older people can be signposted to other services that don't need long-term care, or from the benefits of reablement. That might be something we want to come back to in the question and answers. But also what we're seeing is increasingly complex needs of younger adults, particularly for many younger adults who've got a complex disability, that the nature of their disability will get more complicated over time. So typically, say, a person with a learning disability is much more likely to suffer early onset dementia before they're 65 than somebody without a learning disability. But it also reflects the fact that we've got an increasing number of younger adults who were born with a disability, who are living long lives, which is fantastic and reflects really well on the health input from the NHS. Although I suspect some people will make the point that could be improved still further, but also that the problem is a lot of their unpaid care will diminish as they start to get into their 40s and 50s, and their parents are no longer able to support them or may not be around, unfortunately, to support them. An interesting question in the previous slide, you'll notice relatively low spend on short-term care. And I think people are raising the question, well, if we spent more on short-term care, would we need to spend less on long-term care? And I'll probably come back to that when we come back to the discharge question in the question and answer session. So if we move on now to, you're probably saying, well, we spent £22 billion. That only talks about roughly £17.4 billion. What's the other element? And that's mainly what I would call the managerial, administrative, professional element of providing adult social care. So somebody will be seen by a social worker, and the cost of that social worker not included in that those figures. The occupational therapist who might advise on what adjustments might need to be made in their in where they live, they're not included. And there are obviously costs of running adult social care as well, although I would say the elements in the second bullet point of assessments, reviews, safeguarding, really important element, which does take up quite a lot of important professional resources, but also commissioning services. They're the biggest element, but then there are administration costs inevitably of running any service. And it's probably also worth saying this figure we think is probably a little bit higher than it would be because there was some residual spending on COVID, which local authorities are likely to have included here. Okay, if we move on to the next section. So this is what I want to do is, this is particularly aimed at NHS colleagues, and I hope local government colleagues on the call are pretty familiar with all of this. But I just want the NHS to understand how decisions are made. I mean, the starting point is to remember that each local authority is a separate legal body. It is not part of a great infrastructure that to some extent you would see individual NHS trusts being in, or ICB boards. And so the separateness of local government is really important. Now, we could have a policy debate about whether that's the right way to run adult social care or not, but the fact is this is how it works at the moment. And what I want to do is just go through the way that local government operates, particularly the way that budgets are made. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. The first line applies to obviously every part of the NHS, which is people have a budget, they must live within the resources they have. But there are additional statutory authorities, so they're set out in Acts of Parliament that have been passed by Parliament, which are placed on local authorities. So, for example, local authorities have to set a budget by a particular date. And what that means in practice, local authorities will need to have made the decisions by the end of January each year. And that's partly why you will see a reaction from the government when something's suddenly announced well after that point in time, which then impacts about what local authorities could do. The second thing is local authorities are not allowed to borrow to fund revenue spending. So that means they cannot set, and it's illegal to set a deficit budget. So local authorities will come at their best estimate of the income that's likely to be available next year, and then spending has to be tailored within that. And if spending plans are higher than the likely income, then spending has to be reduced. There are key local authority officers. It's not just the chief finance officer. It's also what's called the monitoring officer. I don't need to go into that today, I don't think, but also the chief executive, who have personal responsibilities to intervene if they think the council is behaving unlawfully or may run out of money. And it's also worth saying there are real constraints on how much local authorities can increase their income. Okay, if I can then move on to the next slide, please. Just to say a bit about where the money comes from, we sometimes hear from government that the implication that adult social care is funded predominantly by central government. That is not true. any longer. And that's partly reflecting what Saffron was talking about in terms of the significant reduction in the main grant to local government. In practice now, most funding is funded by the council tax, including the adult social care precept. It's also worth saying local authorities can decide on the level of the council tax, but only up to a maximum increase that is specified by central government. And that cap has been in place for, we're probably talking about at least as long as I've been working in adult social care. The next biggest contribution is business rates. So businesses locally are paying money, most of which is being spent on either adults or children's social care. But that contribution, the rate, is set by central government. So again, there's no local government discretion on that. The government grants that we receive, that councils receive, is now quite a low proportion. It's around 20% of the total resources available to adult social care. It's probably worth saying a significant proportion of that is for either adults or children's social care, and very little for other services. And it's also important to stress that individuals pay for some council services, adult social care in particular, but there are again rules on charges, and particularly the charges for adult social care are set based on rules published each year by the Department of Health and Social Care. So if I move on then to the looking forward, in terms of the financial challenges. Now, Saffron did a great job of identifying many of the position. She was talking about that the importance of having a comprehensive solution for adult social care, and in her response to the discharge issue, she talked about the importance of that there is a model that's fit for purpose. Now, the Local Government Association, which represents local authorities, set out its position effectively on what would be a fit for purpose model last September. And within the slides, if you look at the notes section, I'm hoping people got access to the notes section, you've got access to the source documents that I've used for this presentation. And basically what the Local Government Association said, well, look, we think if you invested £13 billion a year, which is probably less than 10% of the NHS's budget, this is a way we could tackle historic underfunding of social care. And what that does is two elements: an immediate injection of £6 billion to tackle current pressures and limit their immediate and short-term impact, but £7 billion of investment in a much more wider range. And if we move on to the next slide, this shows the breakdown of that funding. So the immediate pressures, doing something about the immediate pressure of inflation, demography, and it'd be fair to say, and I'll come on to this in the rest of the presentation, there was action taken on that first point by the central government, although I would say, I think with benefit of hindsight, we probably underestimated the impact of that, probably by about £500 million. Doing something about the pay of care workers. I must declare personal interest in this. My sister works in the social care system and is not well paid. So I've got that personal interest, but it'd probably be fair to say she's one of only 1.5 million workers in the social care system who probably would be affected by that. And then also tackling, I think there's a shared acceptance that there is an argument for increasing fees to providers beyond the immediate inflationary pressures, and that will probably cost, in our estimate, about £1.5 billion. But actually more money would need to go into a range of provisions which completely transform the way we help people age, how we support people with disabilities, in a way which means they don't need care in the same way. And by care, I'm including explicitly here not just personal care, but also health care. And I will come back to this, you know, on the discharge point of view. And there's a range of issues here. I think the ones I'd want to flag up in particular are the importance of people living in the right places to reduce the risk of them having some sort of accident or mishap within the place that they live. And the immediate consequence of that is often they end up in hospital in A&E. But I think it's also a wider range of issues about what's available to people, so they don't need to look to the state for long-term care. And things like the role of the voluntary and community sector is crucial there. Community-based crisis services for people with learning disabilities, autism and mental health services, investment in things like handy person services, AIDS adaptations and fall prevention services. And I'd also want to stress, and this goes back to the short-term care point, is should we be spending an awful lot more on short-term care, such as enablement and intermediate care, which means that people don't need long-term care at the end of it, or if they do, they need less. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. What I now want to do is to just really say, well, what's happened since then? That was published last September. And the government did give quite a lot of resources to adult social care. It has described it as the biggest funding increase in history for adult social care in England. I'm not in a position to comment on that, partly because we're in the purdah period running to the local government election. So is that, but I also think it's quite difficult to know whether that's a fair assessment. I think the key thing is, there's two key things. One is it requires council tax to go up by 5%. And that's probably important for all of us to bear in mind when we see our new council tax bills, which you should have had by now. It's also worth the fact that some of it has going to be used for children's social care, which is what the government said and does reflect needs in that area as well. But what it means is we've broadly got about £2 billion more this year to spend on adult social care, best estimate. And actually, the big problem is we may have historic increases in funding, but actually we've got historic financial pressures on adult social care. And the next slide will move on to, will take you through my assessment of those pressures. So what we've got is the practical issue is that most adult social care providers, the biggest element is labour costs, and the people working in adult social care are nearly all working and are being paid the national living wage. So when the government increases the national living wage by 9.7%, which it did this April, and that was, I'm sure, very much welcomed by the people who received it, actually because of that, and because there has been a significant amount of inflation on other costs, you're probably talking about an increase between 8 to 9% in terms of the overall cost pressures on providers. I would say providers will probably dispute that figure and argue it's higher, but that's our best estimate of it. If that's the cost of an 8 to 9% increase in the amount you give to providers, for local government is about £1.5 billion. On top of that, you've got demographic pressures, which is probably at least another £500 million on top of that, which means you've got about £2 billion of pressures, and that's roughly the extra resources available. And we'll move on to the next slide. So what does that mean? Well, that basically means is local government and adult social care have had extra resources, which is great, but it allows adult social care to stand still. It doesn't redress the scale of the response that was set out by the LJ, or which I think Saffron was expecting either. And I think we need to recognise the scale of the problems there are within adult social care. And obviously this needs to be seen in the context of sitting alongside all the pressures that Saffron was setting out for the NHS. So I don't want to minimise those at all, or to even to say that these are more important. But I think we need to see the whole thing together. So the first thing is to say that the information about assessments and reviews comes from ADAS's regular survey that's there, and again within the notes of the slides you can see the source of material for that if you want more information. But I think the important thing is to say between November 21 and August 22, the numbers of people who are waiting for an assessment, for a support, care and support, or for review increased by 1/4 over that period. And in August 2022, nearly 250,000 people were waiting for an assessment, and 1/3 of those have been waiting for more than 6 months. These are obviously much smaller than the NHS numbers that Saffron was referring to, but if you come back to the fact there's 800,000 people who are currently in long-term care, it's actually quite a high proportion when you compare it with that. The next thing is, and there's been a lot of public discussion about that, is there are huge vacancies within adult social care. I can't remember how they compare directly with the NHS, but I think the key thing is we've got chronic vacancy problems in both parts of the health and social care sector. And the King's Fund, in a recent document, described it as the highest since records began. And I think we need to recognise, and again, I'll declare my personal interest, but the fact is it comes back to the level of pay in the adult social care sector. The national living wage is £10.42 per hour, whereas Aldi announced that outside London, they'll be paying £11.40 an hour from the 1st of July. They're paying more in London. So there's a huge discrepancy, and that's the real problem. We're trying to fix the vacancy problem, is that actually, if people can be paid £1 an hour more in Aldi, then many people will choose that option because they have no other choice in the context of the overall cost of living problems. So to move on to the next slide, I'm not going to actually go through this comment. I want you to see it. The government has published People at the Heart of Care, and at the end of March, it is clearly a policy statement from the government, and I'm in Herder. So all I want to do is to refer you to this quote from the Councillor David Fothergill, who chairs the Local Government Association's Community Wellbeing Board and speaks for local government on adult social care matters. And it's probably worth saying the way that the LGA works is cross-party organisation. So he speaks not just for, he is a Conservative, but he speaks on behalf of all the members on that board, and that's the position that he took where in response to the announcement of that policy, and essentially he's described it as a significant watering down of promises. And the problem is the initial proposals are that they would have only been the first step towards a more sustainable and refocused future for social care. So that's the end of my presentation. Hopefully that's around about 25 minutes, Richard. And I'm very happy to answer questions and comments. If you want me to kick off with the question that was asked of Saffron, I'm happy to do that. But it may be there's other things coming on the chat which you feel are more urgent or need a response.
John, thank you for that. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Yes, please do. Let's go straight to the discharge issue, and it'd be fascinating to get your views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first comment is we're starting from the wrong place now, and that's not helpful to systems that are trying to tackle the problem at the moment. And I will say something about the immediate issue, but it seems to me what we've got is a system which seems to suck people into the acute sector. And if you're an older person, and many of us will have experience of that from relatives. I think of my father's experience. It's too easy for somebody to get taken into an acute hospital bed, and the difficulty is once you take an older person into an acute hospital bed, it's rarely actually good for their long-term care. Now, that is not a criticism of the quality of care that's been provided in the hospital service. But the problem is, we know from quite a lot of academic work is that somebody in a hospital bed is likely to deteriorate in terms of their ability to do things themselves. So if you go back to the starting point about adult social care, is their functionality will deteriorate over that period. So ideally what we want to do is stop people going into long-term care, into hospital care. And I think to do that, we need to pick up some of the things that were in the LGA's position statement. So I think the first thing is that we need to make sure that people are living in the right homes. And I've touched on that, and I won't say any more on that. I think people need, older people in particular, who need advice on how they can age successfully, so they are less likely to end up needing acute healthcare. We need the quick responses when problems arise, and that's undoubtedly a problem at the moment, but it's a problem, a system-wide problem, in terms of the response of adult social care, personal care, other services that local authorities are responsible for. It's an issue about primary care, access to primary care. It's an issue about access to community health services as well. So how do those services, how are we going to set those services up so they work together in a way which stops people needing to go into care? Now, I'm not trying to duck the immediate problems, but I think unless we go down that trend, and that this is, I'm not saying anything that people haven't been saying for at least the last 15 years, but how are we as a system going to do that? If you go back to the NHS plan, I think of 2019, there's some great stuff in there. I think the big question for all of us is, have we delivered it? And I think the answer to that is no. And a lot of that is because of the huge pressures that came from COVID. But what are we going to do now about delivering that? And that feels to me the challenge for the integrated systems going forward. In terms of what's going forward, immediate problem, I don't think there's a simple solution. And I was really pleased that Saffron said the same. You know, the reality is, ideally what we'd like is a really good services in the community that people could be going to hospital, get out really quickly, and then go on and are supported in the community. In practice, because that doesn't happen, because people are deteriorating, there's more chance I end up in care homes. That actually makes the problem worse, because spending on somebody in a care home is significantly more than it might be for somebody in the community. So there isn't really a simple solution. I think what I would say, and I think my colleagues would also say, is the best way forward is for local systems to be given the space and required to work out what is the best thing that will work locally. That was my experience when I was working within the health and care system in Oxfordshire. And that is often about the key decision makers, which is not the most senior people, I don't think. I don't think it is the DAS or the Chief Executive of the Hospital Trust. It's the people on a practical day-to-day who are seeing people in hospital and making quick judgments about, and flexible judgments about what can be done in response to that.
John, thanks. You mentioned, actually, just I made a note, you mentioned about your notes and your slides. Just let delegates know that we'll be sending materials out in the next few days. So there'll be a pack coming your way. John, there's a couple of questions about workforce, not surprisingly. I mean, obviously, you mentioned in your chat about the need to look at remuneration for social care workforce. I suppose two questions. Anne-Marie asks about how do we make a change in career pathways in care? I think what she's really alluding to there is, how do we make a career in social care something that would be valued and rewarding and rewarded? And then the second question, I suppose, is really about, should there be a single system of health and care together with a single workforce? So I think there's kind of an immediate piece around valuing careers, and a second piece about longer term integration.
Yeah, the £3 billion that was for pay within the LGA's position statement would broadly pay for an increase in the hourly rate for care workers for about £2 to £3 an hour. It's that sort of magnitude. Probably might need to be varied, because some care worker jobs are more skilled than others. It's probably fair to say home care workers are probably with more responsibility than somebody working in a care home where you've got a supervisor close by. So that would pay for that. That would broadly bring pay into line with the healthcare assistant level 3, right? Sorry, the higher one. I may have got that wrong. It's the higher one. I can't remember if 4 is higher than 3 in terms of the structure or not, but I think people were getting the point I'm making. I think what I would say is that would, I think, help to address the competition that exists from the retail sector, from hospitality, the tourism sector, which are real problems, particularly for areas which are heavily affected by that. That would lead to an idea, well, you'd have something comparable. What I would say is the healthcare assistant, though, because they're eligible to the NHS pension scheme, is still getting quite significantly higher pensions. And that's quite an important issue for people saying, well, if everybody was employed on either NHS standard in terms of conditions, which is an understandable argument, even if they're continuing to be whoever employs them, the cost of doing that, if they then join the pension scheme, would be a significant increase in costs on top of that. And that's something I would say to systems, if they're looking at that option, they need to look at. You've got to bear in mind that the typical adult social care provider will pay no more than 3% towards the pension, which is the minimum they have to contribute. The cost of public sector pensions to employers is probably between 20 and 25%. I'm not an expert on the NHS pension scheme, but certainly that's the impact with the government pension scheme, which is broadly comparable.
Thanks, John. And the wider question about integration, a single workforce, is that something that you think is on the agenda, or is it just pie in the sky?
Well, I think my view is, and we'd had I think overall we were a pretty integrated system in Oxfordshire, and I think that remains the case from what I understand since I left employment with Oxfordshire County Council. I think the key principle is about people working together. To some extent, it doesn't matter the organisational change. I mean, I get the sense NHS colleagues are completely fed up with constant reorganisation. And I think the difficulty with organisations, there's a cost to it. It impacts on individuals, the jobs they're doing. It makes it more difficult to create the right cultural environment and so forth. So for me, the real question is, how do people across the system work really well together? And that is not just about, is there a good working relationship between the DAS and the chief executives of the various NHS bodies in the area, but it's also about people on the ground. So it is, I mean, I gave an example of discharge arrangements, but I think it's also about, what is the practical relationship between the local area social care team and the GP practices in that area? How does that relationship then work with whatever arrangements are in place for community nursing in that area? I mean, certainly my experience of talking to GPs felt frustrated that community nursing was often working in a way which wasn't quite joined up with the nursing offer that was available in the local practice.
Yeah. John, thank you. We're going to have to leave it there. I know you're going to join us again at the end for some final reflections, but that was brilliant. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I was just introducing Anita. Anita's known to many of you because she's a long-standing supporter of this masterclass. She's the Director of Research and the REAL Centre, that's Research and Economic Analysis for the Long Term at the Health Foundation. And Anita is also an Honorary Professor in the College of Social Sciences at the HSMC at the University of Birmingham. Anita is a health economist and has a background in government and public policy. And before joining the Health Foundation in 2014, she was the Chief Economist at the Nuffield Trust. And she's also was awarded the CBE in the Queen's 2017 Birthday Honours List for services to economics and health policy. Anita, lovely to see you again. I will leave it to you to give us our final presentation.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm actually going to focus a little bit in this presentation, when I come to it, on some of the questions about productivity and capacity, picking up on some of the issues that Saffron was talking about earlier on, but also potentially I think we might have quite an interesting discussion with all of us after this about this question about avoiding hospital admissions and just what the future looks like for older people, and what we could reasonably do, picking up on some of the things that John talked about. Next slide, please. I thought I'd start with where the public are, which I feel is quite useful. And we've been working with Ipsos and doing some repeat polling of a representative sample of the public on issues about the NHS. And we've been using questions that are very similar, if not the same, to some questions that Ipsos have used back to 2004 on public attitudes. And just to briefly run through kind of where things are. So the most recent polling is all shown on that dotted line for 2022. So we polled in November 2022. So this was before the worst of this winter. And three questions that I'm highlighting here. The first, which is the red, is people's views on how good the local NHS is at providing people with a good service. The light blue, how good the NHS is nationally at providing a good service. And the reason why we typically ask people about local and national is typically the local view is informed by their own experiences and friends and neighbours. And that tends to be, as you see, more positive in the past than people's perceptions about the national NHS, which is very informed, obviously, by all different types of media. So what is notable at the moment is that actually people's local views and their views of the NHS nationally are very much aligned, and frankly, they've fallen off a cliff. And so whereas pre-COVID, despite all the years of austerity, actually almost 80% of people thought that their local NHS provided them with a good service. That is now down at 40%. And actually the views about the national service it is at a similar level. People have never, the third question I wanted to highlight is the extent to which government has the right policies for the NHS. And whilst people have, generally speaking, prior to COVID, been very positive about local care, they've never been very positive about government policy. And it's, you know, it reached the dizzy heights of almost 40% of people thinking government had the right policies back in sort of 2009-10. It is now down at 10%. So the questions that people are asking about the next general election, it's certainly the case. The public are worried about the NHS, are very worried about that, not just from a national point of view, but actually the local services, and they're not confident at the moment that policies are going to deal with that. Next slide, please. So as a result of that, when you look at the ahead, people are worried that services are actually going to get worse. So 2/3 of people think that services are going to get worse or stay the same, and just 10% of people think that services are going to get better over the next year. Next slide, please. So whilst there's profound concern about the state of the NHS, I don't think it's right at all to assume that the sort of reform to the model is where people want to go, and actually, and where mainstream politics is likely to go for the general election, because actually the same polling shows that people are firmly wedded to the model that we have. So 90% of people think the NHS should be free at the point of use. Broadly, 90% of people think the NHS should provide a comprehensive service available to everybody, and 84% of people think the NHS should be primarily funded through taxation. So where people want, what people want is the current model of the NHS fixed. But they're not confident that that will happen because they're not confident in policy making. So the blue bars show, do they think the NHS will be here in that form in 5 years' time? And the number of people who think it will be free at the point of use, a comprehensive service funded through taxation, is still a majority, but it does fall. And when we ask people what are the issues, therefore, that you really want prioritised in terms of fixing the NHS, and you know, all polling shows similar things, and government and oppositions going into elections will reflect a lot of that polling, there are 5 things that come out. So the first 2 relate to the workforce. So the number 2 priorities that the public report are deal with the workload pressures on the NHS staff and get more staff, increase staffing. So those are the top 2 priorities that the public report. The next 3 that the public raise as priorities then, which obviously you can only do if you've got the staffing, are deal with the elective waiting lists, reduce waiting, ensure that people can have timely access to a GP, and tackle long A&E waits. So in terms of what the political pressure, both from the government and the opposition, is likely to be, given that by and large, politicians, I think, predominantly seek to campaign on the issues that are concerned to people, I think it's unlikely that the election will be very focused on whether or not tax-funded, free at the point of use, comprehensive NHS is the right model or not. But I think it's likely to be very focused on those workforce and quality standards. Next slide, please. So where are we then in terms of the outlook for the NHS going forward? And that's what I'm going to now focus on. So the first thing is just an update on the funding. And this is looking at the average real terms, so that's after allowing for inflation, increase in funding for health as a whole. So that's NHS England's budget, the public health grants, capital spending, and the workforce and training spending. And it's back to 1979-80. And back to 1979-80, the average is just under 4% a year, real terms growth. As you can see, prior to 1997, it was lower than that. We then had the Blair-Brown years, which were much higher. Coalition, very low growth. Some extra funding starting to come in from 2015 onwards. Significant increase during the COVID period and with the long-term plan. Before that, I've excluded test and trace and PP and all of this. We're on a higher baseline, but for the rest of this Parliament, through a combination then actually of not a big headline increase and rampant inflation, we've got broadly flat funding. Next slide, please. And when we look at that in more detail then, and sort of, what in substantive terms the funding position for the NHS looks like, and I've gone back to 2013-14 here, and sorry that timelines don't match, but that's because of the constant NHS reorganisations. So I'm looking at the NHS England day-to-day running cost budget here, and that only existed as an entity back to 13-14. So we are now spending in cash terms 80% more than we were when the NHS England was founded. And so government will say record spending on the NHS, true in one sense. Obviously, more than half of that is eaten up by inflation and rising input costs. And so the growth then is more like a third, just under 40% actually, if by the end, if you do that. And then if you look at the adjusting that for increase in the population, again, that goes down from 3% a year growth to about 2.3%. And then when you account for the fact that the population's been aging through that period, less again. So obviously we are spending less, but in terms of the ability of that funding actually to deliver more care to individuals and higher quality care, or even maintain quality of care, it's that mustard yellow line that really matters, and that's obviously much lower. Next slide, please. So another way to look at this then is also to look at this in terms of international comparisons. So one of the other things that's dominating the public debate in the newspapers is comparisons with other countries. So we've had a look back over that decade preceding COVID at how much the UK spends, and it's UK because that's how international comparisons work, how much the UK spends compared to our nearest neighbours that deliver comprehensive healthcare. That's the EU 14. So the countries that were in the EU before the fall of the Soviet Union. And what you see there is across the UK as a whole, and this is public and private, through that period, we were spending just under £190 billion across the UK. If we'd matched the average of the EU 14 countries through that decade, we would have been spending 20% more. £40 billion more. Now, actually, some countries, Spain, spent less, but that's the average. If we'd matched Germany, which is often talked about as an exemplar, we'd have been actually spending £70 billion more. That's on day-to-day running costs. That's obviously a huge amount of potential capacity and quality. Next slide, please. If we look at capital investment, then similarly, then again, the sort of greeny blue colour it's like a Farrow ball paint chart, this, isn't it? Yeah, the greeny blue colour is what we spent in the UK each year, and that the red is how much more we would have been spending if we'd matched that EU 14. If you accumulate that over the decade, we would have spent £33 billion more in capital investment. Next slide, please. So, and obviously that's part of the story about maintenance backlog, but it's also really important for capacity. And I guess I'm really worried about capacity, and that's what I'm going to mainly talk about, partly because of that legacy of a decade of both limited capital and limited revenue spend and the workforce position, but also because of the outlook going forward. So this is just very basically what we're expecting to happen from the ONS to the number of people in the population who are aged over 85, aged over 65 and over in the last year of their life, so the number of deaths each year, and the total population. And what you see is that from just before COVID through to the end of this decade, 2030, you know, and time is racing ahead, we're going to have a third more over 85s and a fifth more people in the last year of their life. Yeah? So although population growth through this period is not expected to be huge, we are entering a period of a rapid ageing of the population and a lot of people in that last critical phase of their life. Next slide, please. So what that means is that our projections of the amount of care that we're likely to need to provide through that period, if we continue with current levels of care, are that actually through this period for the rest of this decade, compared to the period before COVID, the number of emergency admissions is likely to increase at a higher rate, and the number of planned admissions. But actually, the bigger pressure is on emergency admissions, reflecting the numbers who are very elderly and are in that last phase of life. Next slide, please. So what also makes me very concerned about that is not only obviously we low funding growth, particularly low capital growth, low investment in workforce, but the situation on productivity is very concerning. So this is the ONS's latest estimates of what's happened to public service healthcare productivity, both when you adjust for quality and you don't adjust for quality. Yeah. So the don't adjust is the light blue and the adjust for quality is the darker blue. And obviously, productivity fell dramatically during COVID for reasons that I think we all understand. But actually, if you look at it, productivity improvement in the NHS hasn't increased since 2017. So this is not exclusively an issue, that's the dog walker, sorry. It's not exclusively an issue of COVID. COVID has created a crisis of productivity, but it was starting well before that. Next slide, please. And I worry about that combination of strong productivity and lack of capacity, because the ageing of the population puts huge pressure on one of the biggest sources of productivity failure. Sorry, which is length of stay. Yeah. So as you can see, as we get older, hospital admissions increase, but also the amount of time that we stay in hospital also increases. And this is the decade in which the over 85s are going to increase by a third. Yeah. So we are going to have to run to stand still. We would have already faced a massive challenge of holding capacity, even without the productivity hit. Next slide, please. And this is why that matters so much. So if you look at pre-COVID, we did see a big increase in admissions between 2009 and 2018, a big reduction in length of stay. And so actually, we did have our cake and eat it. More people got treated, but the number of bed days that we had to support actually fell. Yeah. So that was obviously a decade of significant productivity gain. But with the ageing of the population, continuing to achieve that looks challenging. Next slide, please. And so even before COVID, yeah, with that productivity hit, activity was slowing significantly. So in essence, we have had a growing crisis since 2017 of productivity and activity, which was reflected then in rising waiting lists and a service under pressure even before COVID. Next slide, please. So what would that mean in terms of capacity? Well, actually, if we couldn't increase productivity and reduce length of stay over this next decade, to keep up with that rising elderly population, increasing numbers of people at the end of their life, we would actually need 70,000 more hospital beds. That's on a base of around 100,000. Yeah, if we can increase productivity and reduce length of stay, albeit not at such a fast rate, we're still facing the prospect that we might need between 23 and 39,000 extra beds. And so, one of the key issues is one of the mantras of the NHS, over recent decades has been to reduce hospital beds. And I think there is a question about, is that now sustainable? Simon Stevens did say at the time of the long-term plan that we may have gone too far. We are now obviously having some small increase in hospital beds and hoping greatly that virtual wards will take up a lot of this slack. But, virtual wards are going to have to do pretty amazing things in order to address this sort of capacity gap. Next slide, please. And in particular, I think it's really important that we think about that in the context of how we compare internationally. So this is average length of stay across the OECD. And I've put England on as well as the UK. As you can see, we're already got comparatively low average length of stay compared to partner countries. Next slide, please. And very high hospital bed occupancy. So it's not clear that we can work our system much harder and run it much hotter than we already are. Next slide, please. And if we did increase hospital beds in the sort of scale, so 23,000 is that thing, England 2030A, that would take us from kind of 2 hospital beds per 1,000 inhabitants to 2.3, and then the 39,000 would take us up to 2.6, and that 70,000, which just seems an unbelievable number, takes us up to 3.1. So actually, even with sort of 23,000 extra hospital beds, we'd still be amongst the lowest level of acute hospital bed capacity in the OECD. And next slide, please. And obviously, in terms of workforce, the point about beds is also made in the workforce. If we can't reduce average length of stay and get back to those productivity gains, the difference in the number of staff we need is huge. So with no productivity, with the equivalent of that sort of 70,000 beds is almost 400,000 staff. If we can get back to sort of improving productivity and reducing average length of stay, you're talking about the extra staff we need going down to 262,000 staff. So huge difference in the number of extra staff that we'll need in a system that already has big vacancies. So this issue about length of stay and productivity is really material to the size of the challenge that we face and the sort of performance that we can deliver. Next slide. This just shows that at the moment we're on track to actually see the shortfall in staff increase, not reduce. Next slide, please. So part of obviously the NHS England strategy is to put some modest increase in beds, some increase in staff, but rely a lot more on getting system flow to work much more effectively, and that out of hospital offer with virtual wards and integration with social care to pick up the slack. And I guess the question is, in many of the countries that do better than we do in terms of length of stay and productivity, they've got much more investment in that, in a really florid community and social care offer. So I'm just going to finish then with just an update on where we are with social care funding and one slide on the workforce. So on funding, sort of same chart, as you can see, since 2008, low funding, to the point that was made by John earlier on, although now we are seeing an increase in funding, it's actually still below the long run average, and comes on the back of that legacy of reductions in the years of austerity. Next slide, please. So just as earlier on, I showed a slide for the NHS, adjusting for inflation and the population. I've done the same with social care and taken that out to reflect the promised increase in social care funding. And what you see again is obviously not only is the headline figure lower, so the cash increase, it was over 5.8%, for NHS is 3.2% for social care. Inflation erodes most of that. We're down to 1.1% real terms average increase then after inflation. But when you adjust for the growth in the population, and then critically the ageing of the population, which again is that mustard line, what you see is that even with this increase in funding that Jeremy Hunt announced at the budget, we'll be spending, once you adjust for age, in real terms, less in 24-25 than we were 15 years before that. And obviously that doesn't allow for the fact that we've got this increase in need amongst younger adults, which John talked about, which is really critical and would make if you like, the funding available and the squeeze on social care resources even greater. Next slide, please. And obviously, really critically in that is the issue around pay. And John talked about pay comparisons. And so I've just shown here, and this is old now, but it's the latest available from Skills for Care. There'll be new data very soon. What the comparison is with other areas of work. And so at £9.50 an hour back in 21-22 for median care workers, that was below sales and retail, below the average for the lowest fifth of paid jobs in the labour market. But most importantly, I think, because there are significant flows between care workers and NHS, and the issue about comparability with Agenda for Change is really critical. £1 an hour less than a healthcare assistant new to the role, and almost £2 an hour less than a healthcare assistant with 2 years experience. And that's before the pensions, annual leave and wider benefits and job security that comes with the NHS. So, you know, this pay backdrop will actually have been exacerbated, I think, since then, and be potentially worse. And so it is almost certainly not a surprise why do we have vacancies, but actually we need to celebrate colleagues who stick with social care in the long term, despite the extreme impact on them and their families and their cost of living. Thank you.
Anita, thanks so much for that. Really informative, sobering as always. I'm going to take some questions now. Anita, I'm just going to start a couple of questions actually. I think, as always, you use the data to paint such a compelling scenario for the future. But it's always a scenario that for me isn't really in the minds or on the lips of operational leaders who are kind of trying to manage for today. What, if nothing changes in terms of, you know, new government funding promises along the Blair-Brown axis or workforce solutions, how does the situation look to you in 5 years' time if nothing changes? Because it does seem like another tsunami coming our way.
Yeah. So I think the big risk is actually the model that we see in dentistry, essentially, and I think dentistry might be seen as the canary in the mine for where this goes, which is that actually we see a lot of you're already getting stories, aren't you, where people are going to their GP and the GP is saying, I will refer you, but you know, have you got either money or insurance so that you'll be able to pay, because you'll be waiting ever such a long time, and I'm not sure it's worth me referring you unless you can afford to pay privately. Yeah, and so I think the big fear is the two-tier service, where for elective care, a huge number of people are going private, and the NHS funds the service of last resource and is actually locked into something of a cycle of inefficiency, because we're having to pick up people very late. And actually, although we've spent 20 odd years wanting to move from big sickness to a health service, we really do become that almost exclusive rescue service, and that's the big fear, isn't it?
Thanks, Anita. Chris, I'm going to let you come in.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Hi, Anita. As always, fantastic presentation. I think I've probably heard about 4 or 5 of these over the years. Yeah. And I suppose my overriding reflection is the message isn't really changing. So if you showed these slides to anybody, you get the same impression, wouldn't you, that this is going to be a massive issue in the next 10 years or so. So I suppose the question really is this a simple case of we have to wake up to the fact that we need additional funding? So by any comparison, we're underfunded, we're under-resourced, and we haven't got enough capacity. Or do you really genuinely think there are efficiencies that we could make that might help us bridge the gap? Is it too late? Is the gap too big? And is it a case that we need the additional funding because this can't be solved through efficiencies?
Yeah. So if I was in charge for the day, as it were, and thinking about it, it's right. There are 2 things that I think would be really important for me. One is this was a decade in the making, so to be honest, it'll be a decade in fixing. Yeah. So I am deeply skeptical of recovery plans. Yeah. Short-term recovery plans, because this is the product of a failure to address the fundamentals, and I would argue can only be fixed by a focus on the fundamentals. Yeah, and so actually, if I was, so I think it needs a 10-year plan. Really critically, it needs a 10-year plan that covers NHS and social care. Yeah, genuinely integrated. And it needs a 10-year plan that starts not with the short-term waiting list pressure, but starts with the investment in capital, IT, and workforce. That means then that actually we're in a position to spend money well. Because the big worry I have, actually, if you came in about throwing money at the current system, is we lock ourselves into actually systemic inefficiencies. And we need to be honest with the public that it will take a long time to turn this around, but we're actually going to focus on creating the capacity and the ways of working in the system that mean that actually every pound that goes in can be spent well, both in terms of classic sort of efficiency, reducing waste, but also in terms of sort of service that actually reflects the 21st century. So for me, if I was advising an incoming government, that in the next parliament, I would go massively on the workforce training, complete digital transformation of the infrastructure across NHS and social care. I'd sort out social care workforce terms and conditions and employment, and on a capital investment programme, which would build both the comprehensive integrated out of hospital system and actually put more capacity into our acute system, because I actually do think actually with the population changes that we've got, it's just not realistic to think that we can not increase our beds.
Anita, thanks for that. Thanks for the question, Chris. It leads me on to my second question nicely, actually. Anita, you started off talking about public perceptions and how they've changed over time. You may not have this data, but I'm just interested. I think we take for granted in the NHS, or we assume that the public are prepared to foot the bill for what's needed. Do we have a sense of where the public are in terms of the actual cost of health and care?
Yeah, so actually, people do. People are incredibly sensible, actually. Yeah. So firstly, they know that actually, if you haven't got the workforce and if they're run ragged, yeah, there's not a lot you can do. Yeah. So they do start with, actually, we haven't got the capacity. So they actually diagnose the problems pretty accurately. And then they also realise that actually, in the end, you get what you pay for. Yeah. And that if we want a high quality service, we are going to have to pay for it, and they want to actually, they see a tax funded system as fair. There are the two things though that they feel strongly about. One is they see waste routinely, particularly in the join between services. They see waste and inefficiency, and they want us to deal with that properly. Yeah? So actually, more funding and tackling waste and inefficiency aren't alternatives. Yeah, as far as, I mean, we need to see them as twin parts of the solution. Yeah, so that's the kind of first thing I think, and the second thing obviously is fairness in tax really matters as well. Yeah. So a lot of the issues around social care, I think, are that a lot of the burden of paying for social care has been falling on the precept and on council tax. And there's quite a lot of evidence, obviously, about how unfairness in council tax.
Yeah, thank you. We're drawing to a close, but I've got one more question from Honorary, which we can sneak in before we ask all our speakers to just come back and join us for final remarks. So Honorary just asked how we can get the public on board, and this, you may have touched upon this actually, your last answer, but how we can get the public on board with the issues and challenges given all the political spin and apathy in relation to health and care.
Well, actually, public are more on board. I would highlight, I think, two things. I mean, one is, I think, operational excellence really matters. Doing the basics brilliantly really, really matters. Yeah. So all the stuff that is often very, very dull. Yeah, like how you organise appointments and cancelling appointments and test results going missing and all of that sort of stuff profoundly undermines confidence in the system. So, trust us, we can use your money really well when it appears that we can't do the basic things like getting a letter to you for an appointment before the appointment has actually happened, is quite a difficult pitch. Yeah. So I think as leaders in the system, getting the basics brilliantly actually really, really does matter. Yeah, and that matters for our staff as well, because actually the public's frustrations and staff frustrations are often pretty much the same, and they're the things that make it hard to use the service and hard to work in the service. So that stuff, that isn't sexy, isn't exciting, really, 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 really matters.
Yeah.
Second thing is, I think that what the alternative to hospital is just feels, I think, to most people like a lot of jargon and very vague. Yeah, and they see immense pressure, and people are saying, but the solution is avoiding hospital, but get you out. But none of that feels really very coordinated, joined up, tangible, or real. Yeah, and most people's with their older people, experience of discharge is frankly horrifying. Yeah, to be on the receiving end of it, and we just need to be real about that. Yeah. So at the moment, I think closing the rhetoric and reality gap for people. So on getting the basics done really, really well, and showing people tangibly what the alternative is that is fundamentally better. Those, I think, are the things that get us the permission and the space to be able to reform and invest.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. Great way to leave the Q&A. I'm going to leave you for 2 minutes, just reflect on your final key message from everything you've told us from now. And let's just invite John Jackson to join us again, and Chris is here as well. So as we start to wrap up, just a few final words from ourselves as speakers and chairs, etc. I mean, what I'm taking away from today is that all these challenges are interconnected. There's no one lever that if you pull that one lever, the world is a better place for it. So whether it's about funding, productivity, workforce, capability, backlog, etc. These are all, I think, interconnected things which we need to understand the complexity between them, rather than see any kind of particular silver bullet. This is the solution to what fixes our health and social care crisis. The second thing for me is, given the huge operational pressures, both in health and care, we still somehow need to find the capacity and probably the resilience to focus on the long term. And if we don't focus on the long term, there's no other room where that long-term conversation is happening. So how do we find that space and the ability, I think, to put aside this hour's problem and today's problem and focus on the problem for the next decade? Because otherwise we're walking towards this challenge. And I think as leaders, we need to be more accountable to the longer term. So those are the things that I'm taking away. John, I'll come to you next. I mean, any final reflections from your perspective?
I mean, the first thing I'd want to say is the third time I've contributed to this event, and I personally learn an enormous amount from the NHS speakers at it. So thank you, Anita. It's the third time I've heard you. It's always interesting, but Saffron was equally interesting, and I think has taken over well from Chris in that role. I'm trying to not get too depressed, because to some extent, I remember the stories about the funding challenges. I remember coming the first time and hearing Chris talk about what happened to NHS funding compared to what had happened historically, and he was going right back to, I think, 1945 on that occasion. Sorry, 48, Anita. I think for me, the most positive thing is, well, first of all, the most positive, there's two things that's positive. One is the system as a whole still working really, really hard to try and manage this. And I think we need to give credit to the people on the sharp end about what they're doing. I think there is a real risk about burnout. That certainly has been a big theme that's come out about the industrial disputes in the NHS. And I think that's probably echoed within the adult social care thing. It's much more difficult to get staff's views because you've got lots and lots of different providers, and it's not really unionized at all. The second thing is, Anita, I did really like what you said about this is a decade-long problem. It's going to take a decade to fix it. I think for me, the real question is, how can we make sure that is, and you said we have to be honest with the public, and I strongly agree with that. I think the real question is, how do we ensure there's political debate about that in the run-up to the next election? Certainly going to be an issue I'm going to take back, because obviously local government association is ultimately a political organisation, as to how do they, what can they do to help with that debate? And I think other people will have access to politicians, both local and national politicians, and they may want to be reflecting some of that in the debate. We do need a much more mature approach. I mean, one of the reflections I would say is, when I became the DAS in Oxfordshire in 2007, I was only about a year before I realised the scale of the implications of the ageing of the population. But actually, in practice, far-sighted people will have been talking about that probably in the 80s and certainly in the 90s. And how come that we as a society have not faced up to that challenge, and also the equivalent challenge there are with younger adults about more people living a lot longer, which is a fantastic outcome, but does have consequences in terms of what support might be available. Well, how do we as a society have a much more informed and intelligent discussion about these issues, rather than going on the latest bit of stuff that's come out?
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Anita, any key messages from your perspective?
So if I want to echo your point that I think integrated care systems for providers, the leadership challenge is to create the headspace and the sort of countervailing force to think about the long term. I think that is, you know, I think supporting people short term, and that is really important. But actually, one of the things that's really critical is we've got to give people a sense of hope and a sense that there is an answer. And neither our staff nor the public are daft. You know, they know that no one can click their fingers and everything's going to be absolutely hunky-dory. But there's an enormous premium on credible, coherent leadership, I think, which acknowledges where we are, yeah, and gives people a sense that actually the people in charge know what they're doing, and there is a path to a sustainable future. That must be what holds people in the system and holds with it. The more tactical thing I would say is that I think there is a chance of additional capital investment, a once in a generational capital investment after general election. And I do hope the NHS and social care actually are ready to, with really good plans locally, for how we would take advantage of that and the results of a workforce plan and digitisation and really leapfrog, yeah, to where we need to be. And being ready, you know, is very, very important.
Thank you, Anita. And Chris, any reflections from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I mean, as ever, been a fantastic session, and a huge thank you to all our presenters. It's been really, really great. I particularly like this event because it's grounded in reality, isn't it? So it might be a grim message, but we get in the real data, the real facts, which I absolutely love. I think, agreeing with Anita, we've got to be careful we don't take away a doomsday message and a doomsday narrative from today, because it would be so easy to do that. But of course, we've got to be realistic. I suppose my one reflection on this is, what collectively are we able to do about the workforce challenge? So I think that's the single biggest thing that we're facing. And it'd be interesting to see some data maybe next time about what's the vacancy situation going to look like by 2030. So we talked in the first session from Saffron about 120,000 vacancies. If you apply the same kind of thinking, the aging population, the changes that we know we're facing, in 7 years' time, what's that going to look like? And if you put those data alongside the industrial action media, the things that we're seeing every day on our TV screens, would that change people's perceptions any bit? Would it help us with the narrative? Does it give us a focus? So if we know exactly the kind of problem that we're going to be facing, it's already bad, but it's going to be really bad in 7 years' time. What can we do today that's going to help us stop us getting into that situation in 7 years' time? I think that's my number one takeaway from today.
Yeah,
but hugely enjoyable session, and huge thanks to everybody that's participated and presented today.
Fantastic. And Chris, I'll come back to you for the very final word, just to bookend. But it just remains for me to just finish my bit here by thanking everyone, all the speakers and the audience for joining us. We know it's an incredibly pressured time, as we discussed at length today. So to give up the time to join, hopefully we provided some value back for you, but thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, all material will be shared over the next coming days. And as you can see on the slide, and you can see in the chat as well, it's incredibly important for us to get the event evaluation and feedback from you. So please do click on the link. There's a Survey Hero link in the chat, or use a QR code if you're so minded on the slides there. But any way you want to, the feedback is greatly appreciated and incredibly useful for preparing for the next events. Speaking of which, there is another masterclass on Wednesday, the 10th of May, which will be about maximising the potential of our people. And again, there's an Eventbrite link in the chat as well. Again, as I started, just to say thank you very much for inviting me back. I've had a fantastic morning. I've learned so much from everybody. So it's a real privilege to be here. And I'll just hand over to Chris for the final word.
Yeah, thanks again, Richard. And a huge thank you to you personally for chairing today's session. It's been a real privilege to be working with you again. And a huge thanks to the team behind the scenes who pulled all this together, because it does take an awful lot of organising. It's gone really smoothly today. So thank you, everybody, for your support and input, as always. And look forward to seeing everyone again on the 10th of May. So thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.